I'm going to start this presentation by sharing with you a trade secret. So this is my 10th Gartner event, and I've learnt a thing or two about presenting in the last 8.5 years as a Gartner analyst. So I'm going to share with you the trade secret of all Gartner presentations, and that is that, including the keynote that you just saw earlier today, all presentations have to have a kind of visual metaphor running through it. So here is my visual metaphor for this presentation, and it goes like this. That running is a bit like the pursuit of growth. Now, it's a bit of a weak metaphor, so I'm going to unpack this for you a little bit. So I'm a runner. I used to be a pretty good runner, but now I'm 8.5 years older than when I first joined Gartner, so I'm a little bit older, a little bit slower, a little bit more injured, but still, every day, runners have got to run. So 5:45 this morning, I was out, despite the altitude, running the mean streets of Aurora. But just like runners have got to run, enterprises have to grow. And we see this from data from the CEO and Senior Business Exec survey that we published just a few months ago. And this said that CEOs are really hungry for growth in 2024. So 62% of CEOs placed growth as their top business priority. And indeed, it was the top business priority of CEOs when we ranked them. Now, you might find that unsurprising because, of course, CEOs want growth. But what's interesting is that mentions of growth were at a 10-year high. So all of the disruptions of the last few years have meant that CEOs are hungrier for growth than they've ever been. So runners got to run, enterprise got to grow. But the tricky thing is that we're in a situation right now where we have to grow when things are tough. Now, as a runner, I know that not every day is going to be a beautiful sunny morning like it was. That I live in the north of England, so I have my fair share of grey, wet mornings where I have to get out and put my shoes on. But the weather's not important. It's about knowing what the weather is going to be before you set out running, which means whether you have a good or a bad run. And the same is true of our strategies. Knowing what the environment looks like before we build the strategy is incredibly important. And I believe the CMO Spend Survey is an essential tool to unpack that. So, some of you may be new to the CMO Spend Survey, so I'm just going to take a second to tell you a little bit about it. So what is it? Well, it's an essential marketing benchmark tool since 2012. I've been working on it for about 8.5 years now, as I mentioned. It's a survey that looks at North America and European marketers and the senior-most marketers within those organizations. It covers 10 industries across 8 countries. The median revenue is around about $5 billion. And you can see that it covers a range of different types of businesses. And that's important because we're going to look at an aggregated level at the data from this survey. There will be some industry-specific cuts that we'll look at. But if you want to get deeper on the industry side, I would recommend that you check Conference Navigator for those industry spin-offs that are coming over the next couple of days. So that's what the survey is. Now, we only have 30 minutes together, so this cannot be a marathon. So this is going to be more like a 5-kilometer trot through the survey. So I'm going to share with you 3 sections today. So we're going to start with a look at the state of marketing budgets in 2024. Oh, let me go back a second so that I can show you the 3 sections that we're going to look at. We're going to look firstly at the state of marketing budgets in 2024. We're going to then look at the resource priorities that are shaped by those budgets, and then we'll look at the channel trends that we're seeing. So let's start with the state of marketing budgets. So a popular assumption may be that if CEOs want growth, that means they're going to give us some more money, right? Unfortunately, that's not the case. So we track marketing budget as a proportion of company revenue, and this line chart tells a slightly depressing situation. That average marketing budgets have gone down from 9.1% of company revenue in 23 to 7.7 in 24. And we've been in a bit of an interesting space post-pandemic, that we've all hoped that budgets would go back up again, but they just simply haven't. Now, I would argue that this is because we are in a new era for marketing budgets, an era of less. And this chart tells an interesting story because, on average, marketing budgets are 2.8 percentage points lower post-pandemic than pre-pandemic. So the 4 years before the pandemic, marketing budgets were at 11% of company revenue. The 4 years immediately following the pandemic, 8.2%. So a significant and different era that we are in right now. And this means that we need to think hard about what that means for marketing. It could speak to something around productivity, that maybe this is because all of that AI stuff has helped us become much more productive. Or it could be that we just simply don't have enough budget, because there's a bit of a kind of fine line between productivity and privation. Now, privation is a bit of a Dickensian sounding word, but it simply means the state of not having enough resources. So what do CMOs feel about this in 2024? Well, it's kind of a mixed situation, that there's definitely a story of productivity. 73% of CMOs said that they are being asked to do more with less, and that is the essence of productivity. But 64% said that they do not have enough budget to execute their plan in 2024. So that speaks to privation. So a tricky situation, but not all CMOs feel the same. I mentioned that we've got 10 different industries, so let's take a look at where a few different industries are sitting in terms of their marketing budget, because budget lane matters. Again, going back to the running analogy, that anyone who's run a 400-meter race knows that the outside lane of the track is about 50 meters longer than the inside lane. So some industries are on that inside track and some on the outside track. So the industry that's reported the highest budget in 2024 is media, with 9.3% of company revenue allocated to marketing. And that's not particularly surprising for an incredibly aggressively competitive industry where share of voice needs to be maintained in order to secure market share. So around about the middle, the kind of median respondents that we saw from our survey are respondents from pharma at 7% of company revenue. And again, my colleagues who are industry experts in pharma tell me that this is because there's still a great deal of money being spent on digitizing the marketing function within pharma. But in that outside lane, the people who got the toughest race in 2024 are consumer products marketers, who have only 6.7% of company revenue allocated to marketing. And what's interesting about this is down from more than 10% in 2023. And it reflects the kind of volatility that consumers are facing in 2024. And we can see this really clearly with this cut of the data, where we look at the comparison between B2C and B2B budgets. And on the whole, B2C budgets in 2024 are significantly lower than their counterparts in B2B. It's a tough place to be right now. And there are definitely impediments to getting that more budget. So all of those different cuts were below that 11% of company revenue pre-pandemic. So what's getting in the way of securing more budget in this era of less? Well, the kind of strategic hurdles that CMOs are facing are interesting and varied. So these are the top 3 strategic hurdles that CMOs reported in our survey. 2 of them are external, 1 of them internal. And the external ones are not particularly surprising, I guess, because inflation and interest rates are, of course, still having an impact on how marketing gets its funding. But the middle lane there is interesting because the ROI that we get from our digital investments is also a significant strategic impediment in 2024. Now, we're going to dig into that in a little bit more detail in a few slides' time, so bear that in mind. But there's also another significant internal impediment that's getting in the way of marketing budgets in 2024, and that's how your colleagues perceive marketing. So we hinted at this in the keynote, but I just want to double down on this data point that almost 50% of respondents to the survey this year said that marketing is seen as a cost, not a profit center. And actually, reports of marketing as a cost center are up year over year, and this has to get in the way of marketing being able to secure greater budget. So, some important information, and maybe a slightly difficult information for us to get a hold of, but what I want you to do is think about this as important kind of data that will fuel our strategy. So a good runner needs training tips. And I'm going to give you training tips at the end of each of these sections. So what are the 3 training tips based on what we've just seen from that data? So what I would say is that based on what we've just seen, that firstly, because CEOs want growth, we need to make growth absolutely fundamental in our value stories for marketing budget. So we've got to put that front and center of all of the asks that we have for budget in 2024. Secondly, you need to identify your hurdles that are getting in the way of your budget, because by understanding those hurdles, you will be better able to jump them. And thirdly, you need to prioritize productivity, that in the era of less, getting more out of your marketing budget is incredibly important. Okay, so that is the first lap of this presentation. So on to the second lap, and this is about resource, priorities, and trade-offs. How are CMOs actually spending their money in this era of less? Now, I'm going to start this with another assumption, which is that, well, if we need to deliver growth, surely that means that we need to get more customers, right? Well, yes and no, because again, going back to that CEO survey that I showed earlier on, CEOs want the growth to come both from more revenue, but they also want it to come from more profitability, because 55% of CEOs said that they expect a higher rate of return from internal investments in 2024. And CMOs get this, that they are actually taking steps to get more efficiency and returns from their marketing investments. So they're doing things like driving more performance from their assets or transforming their operations, which is important. But the other really important thing that they're doing is they're actually reprioritizing their spending in 2024. Because 67% of respondents this year said that they had changed their investments in major resources and programs. And we're going to look at some of that right now. So how marketing gets work done is complex, but you could break it down into just 4 simple areas. It spends money on agencies, people, technology, and media. And we've been tracking this for years. So this line chart tells a really interesting story about the mix of those different resources. Now, if you look in the middle of this chart between about 2019 and 2023, there's been a huge amount of stability in the investments across these areas. But if you look to 2024, I would argue that there's been a pretty radical reprioritization of the resource mix, because some of those have shifted down significantly and one has gone up. So I'm going to isolate a couple of these resource areas now. So let's take a look at media. So the investment of the total marketing budget that's going into media is up from 25.6% of of marketing budgets, I should say, to 27.9% of marketing budgets. So it's getting a bigger slice of the pie in 2024. And you might ask why? Well, I think the answer is pretty obvious, that if you need to drive growth, that media can be seen as being the most productive source of growth within marketing. That, again, that share of voice, share of market kind of argument that we all heard about back in marketing school. But this is resting on an assumption that we can get the most value out of our media investments. And there's some difficult data in the survey that tells us that there may be some impediments to that, because we track capability gaps in the survey year over year. And the top 3 capability gaps that CMOs told us about in 2024 speak to getting the most out of your media investment. So the top 3 capability gaps are personalization, multi-channel marketing, and journey orchestration. Now, this is despite the fact that AI and investments in technology make this easier than ever. So on the subject of technology, let's home in on another one of those resource areas. So let's take a look at tech investment. So we can see on this line chart that tech investment has been facing a downward trend for some years. And between 2023 and 2024, it's declined from 25.4% to 23.8% of the marketing budget. So this is a smaller slice of a smaller pie. So a really significant real-term cut in the amount that marketing is spending on technology. Now, does that mean that we are spending less at an enterprise level on marketing technology? Well, the answer is no. That this is a story where budgets are being displaced, not disappeared. And there's a couple of really interesting points from 2023's MarTech survey that speak to why this is happening. So the first comes back to that point that I said earlier on about the ROI from digital investments. Now, this line chart shows the utilization rate of marketing-owned technology investments. And you can see that pretty steep decline in utilization rates in just 3 years. So we're not getting the ROI that we should be getting out of our MarTech investments. And perhaps as a consequence of that, that same survey tracked that CMOs are ceding control of key elements of marketing technology strategy and implementation. So we are getting less bang for our buck, and we are losing influence when it comes down to marketing technology. Now, you may be asking, well, what about AI? Wasn't that going to change all of this? Wasn't it going to transform marketing technology? And indeed it is. But that's not necessarily helping marketing keep hold of more budget, because we've seen that budget is declining. But there's also an interesting trend, because marketing is not the only function interested in AI. And as such, the IT function is becoming empowered by CEOs to kind of take all of the use cases from across the enterprise, from across the different functions, to build an enterprise AI strategy rather than a marketing AI strategy. So you could argue that actually AI is eroding marketing-owned technology. But despite that, CMOs still feel really positive about AI. So we asked about the impact of AI, both generative and other types of AI, on marketing's budget and strategy. And more than 3/4 of CMOs responded that they felt really positive about the impact of AI in 2024, which is a great thing. And they also reported that they're seeing really positive impacts from AI this year as well. And those impacts are in meaningful areas when it comes to a budget-constrained environment, because it's helping marketing to become more cost and time efficient, which is great, going back to that productivity challenge that I talked about earlier on. Now, the thing that it's not necessarily helping CMOs do to the same extent is reduce costs yet. But I think it's still quite early days, and hopefully we will see some of those cost reduction benefits flowing through in future years of CMO spend surveys. But for now, that brings this section to an end. So I'm going to, again, focus on the training tips that we can focus on based on what we've just seen. So firstly, what do we need to do? Well, we've just seen that there's been that radical reprioritization of the resource mix. So it's really important that you benchmark your investments in agencies, people, technology, and media, because it may have changed significantly over the last 18 months. Secondly, when it comes down to your marketing technology strategy, going back again to the keynotes, we need to work out the things that it's important for us to get involved in and the things that are not important to us, that don't actually help us. So we need to build a capability-oriented MarTech strategy that lets us differentiate between the things that we absolutely must own and the things that we can give away to IT. And thirdly, we need to embed AI-powered efficiencies into your marketing organization, because we could see from that slide just a second ago that your peers and competitors are doing that. So if you're not getting those kind of cost and time efficiencies now, it's really time to start focusing on that. Okay, so we've done 2 laps. We're on the final lap now. And this is some really interesting data around marketing channel trends. So again, we're going to start with an assumption that growth would mean more share of voice rights. You'd be right to make that assumption based, I guess, on this slide that I shared earlier on, because we did say that the total share of marketing budget allocated to media is up. But again, I'm going to go back to that pie metaphor, that this is a bigger slice of a smaller pie. So the interesting thing is that in real terms, media budget is actually declining at an enterprise level. So if we look at media spend against enterprise revenue, we can see that it's still over 2%, but it has been declining slightly over the last 3 years. So a declining real-term investment in our survey respondents in media investment. And that's kind of interesting, because the narrative around media investment in 2024 is one where it's a boom time because of major sporting events and political events across the globe. But for our respondents to this survey, they have less money to spend on media than they have done in 2022, for example. So this means, again, reprioritizing. So how are CMOs reprioritizing across the different journey stages? So again, this is a cool bit of data, and we don't have a lot of time to dig into it, but definitely I would recommend that anyone who is a Gartner client in this room digs into this in the research that we will be publishing around the CMO Spend Survey, because this shows that CMOs are changing some of their investments across journey stages, and they're more likely, for example, to be spending on the kind of performance media channels that drive conversion to sale, and maybe a little bit less likely to be spending on those things that drive loyalty and retention. An interesting strategic choice in a time when you have budget constraints. But how are they actually spending that money on channels? Well, let's take a look at that. So of that 27.9% of the marketing budget that's going into channels, the split across online and offline channels looks like this: 57.1% into digital, 42.9% into offline. And the proportion of budget that has gone to digital this year is up on last year, up from 54.9%. So in the era of less, we are spending more on digital channels. And that probably makes sense to a lot of people. But what's digital channels? So this is a simplified view of the cut of digital channels. And again, if you're a Gartner client, there is a much longer view of this list that you can get from the write-up of the CMO Spend Survey that we published a couple of weeks ago. But you can see from this simplified view that search advertising is dominating the digital channel mix in 2024. And again, in a budget-constrained environment, and in environments where we are perhaps looking more at conversion to sale than we are at loyalty, that makes a lot of sense. But the surprising thing about this is that search advertising has firstly displaced social advertising as the #1 digital channel, and who thought that would have happened a couple of years ago? But also, if you look at the total that is going into search from SEO and paid search, almost a quarter of the digital budget is going onto the search engine results page in a year when AI is having a really transformative impact on search. So an interesting place to be right now. But what about offline channels? Well, again, there's some interesting data in terms of the CMO's priorities across different offline channels. And I'm going to focus on the top 3 channels: events, sponsorship, and TV, because there's only just over 1 percentage points difference between these 3 channels. So while the amounts that CMOs are spending on these channels is roughly comparable, the perceived value that they get from these channels is really quite different. Because you would assume in a budget-constrained environment that CMOs would focus on the most impactful channels, right? Well, you would assume that, but our data says that that might not be the case. So those of you who've been following the CMO Spend Survey over the last few years may not have seen this kind of data cut that I'm just about to share with you, because this is cool new stuff for 2024. Because this year what we've been able to do is both look at the amount that CMOs are spending on channels, but also look at the perceived value that they think they're getting from these channels. And we get that by asking them, okay, what are the most important channels that you have when it comes down to awareness, consideration, conversion, and loyalty and advocacy? So we create a journey impact rank for each of those channels based on CMO's perceived value that they're getting from those channels. And we've mapped this on a chart that looks a bit like this. So let's just take a second to unpack this before I share the data. So if you are channel A, a digital channel in the top right, this means that as a CMO, we are spending a lot of money on that channel, but we're also getting a lot of value from it that's delivering a lot to our target audiences. If we are looking at channel B, an offline channel in this instance, that we're spending a lot on this channel, but we're not necessarily getting the same sort of value, that actually the perceived value that CMOs are reporting is quite low. Whereas channel C, which is the really sweet spot, we're not spending very much on this channel, but we're getting a huge amount of benefit from it. So that's the simplified view. Let me just show you the much more complex constellation of channels. So this is one of those slides where I would definitely recommend you get your phone out and take a photo of it, or get onto Conference Navigator and download it, because it's pretty busy. But what this tells us is there's a lot of differences in the dynamics of value across channels in 2024, that we invest in a whole bunch of different online and offline channels, and we get a whole bunch of different perceived value from those channels, which is really cool. But what we're going to do is we're going to actually declutter this slide so we can make a little bit more sense of it. So let's start with a slice of this which looks at digital channels. So if we home in on digital channels, we can see some interesting things here. So I mentioned that search advertising is the channel that gets the most budget out of digital channels, and indeed, actually, it gets the most budget out of all channels, but it's not perceived by CMOs to be the most impactful channel, that they actually perceive video and streaming to be way more impactful than search. Now, part of this is in the nuance of where search delivers value in journeys, and it's much more likely to be used in consideration and conversion than in awareness and loyalty. But if you look at video and streaming, that's actually pretty impactful across all of those different journey stages, hence why it's ranked so highly. Let's take a look at offline channels then. And again, I'd mentioned earlier on that there's only just over 1 percentage point that separates those 3 highest spend ranked channels. So linear TV, sponsorship, and event marketing. So we spend roughly the same amount of money, but there's a huge difference in the perceived value that we get from them, with event marketing seen as being pretty impactful and certainly important across some journey stages. But sponsorship and TV have a declining rate of perceived impact, with TV really right down on that low impact end of the chart there. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to blend the right-hand side so that we can see all of the online and offline channels that are delivering high value. And I'm going to draw your attention towards the bottom right in this instance. So if you look at email and retail media networks, we don't spend a lot of money on those channels, but they have a huge perceived positive impact. So again, I know that within, the realities of media planning mean that there are going to be caps to how much we can invest in those channels, but it makes sense in those high impact, low spend channels that we need to investigate how we can get more money into those channels to get more bang for our buck. Now, if we home in on the low impact channels, again, a cluster of online and offline channels. And I think it's kind of interesting as you look at some of those online channels that are in the bottom left right now, because if you think about the kind of narrative around digital channels a few years ago, you would think that nobody could do any wrong by investing in digital channels. Yet we've got a cluster of these online channels that are sitting in that bottom left space that are actually some of the least impactful channels according to CMOs' perceptions. Now, I don't think that this means that these are not valuable channels by any stretch of the imagination. I think the one common factor across all of these channels that you can see on screen right now is they're really hard to measure. And in 2024, despite all the advances that we've had around data and analytics, we still are in a position where we invest in channels and we're not absolutely sure of the value that they're delivering across journey stages, which is a super interesting place to be and a difficult place to be right now. Now, I'm going to leave you with one last view of this, where I home in on two kind of relatively similar channels. So we've got video and streaming in the far right, the most impactful channel, and we've got linear TV. Now, linear TV is interesting because it is the third highest ranked of all channels. So we're spending a lot of money on linear TV. But if you look at digital video, we only spend 10% of the total media budget on video and streaming, and it's the most impactful. So it shows that firstly, that not all screens are the same, but it also shows something is a little bit out of whack here. Because it made me ask the question when I first saw this data point of, why would you invest in a channel that you don't perceive to be impactful or effective? But it also made me think about some of those classic media planning tools that we've maybe put to one side, because it made me think it's time to get really serious about reach, cost, and quality again. We've got to go back to some of those old-fashioned ways about thinking of the impact that we get from our channels and how they deliver value across different journey stages. Okay, so that brings me to the end of this channel view, and there's tons more data on that. So if you're a Gartner client, watch out for that, different cuts of this to publish over the next few months. But for now, again, your training tips from this section are reacquaint yourself with your target audiences, because based on what we've just seen there, where we invest in a lot of channels, and we maybe have some preconceptions about how valuable those channels are to our customers, and that might have changed quite a bit over the last couple of years. So it's time to take a look at that again. Secondly, revisit your channel plans, and this time do it with this sharp focus on journey value. Have that kind of scatter graph in your head when you're thinking about your journey plans, and think about what perceived value do you get from those different channels. And thirdly, focus on channel measurement. That it might not be that those are not impactful channels, you may just not be able to measure them as effectively. So let's think of those measurement tools and proxies that we can use to be able to get a picture of exactly how valuable they may be. Okay, we've done the 3 laps. We've looked at the stated budgets, we've looked at the resource priorities, and we've looked at those channel trends. Now, at the beginning, I said to you that marketing is a bit like the pursuit of growth, and running is a bit like the pursuit of growth. Now, as a runner, I rely a lot on data, so I hope that I've given you at least some good data points to think about how you can get fit for the race in 2024. And there's lots more to come. You're going to see more cuts of this across Symposium, across a whole bunch of different presentations. Please do download the research if you're a Gartner client if you haven't already done so. But I think what I'm going to do is, rather than leave you with one last data point, I'm going to leave you with one last top secret tip about how to do a Gartner presentation. And just as in the keynote, I'm going to leave you with an inspirational quote, because that's what you've got to do if you're doing a Gartner presentation right now. And this is a great quote from a book that I love about running. This is the book, What I Talk About When I Talk About Running. And in this book, he says that exerting yourself to the fullest within your individual limits, that's the essence of running and a metaphor for life. Now, I would say that exerting yourself within the fullest of your limits is a metaphor for delivering growth in 2024. Thank you so much for your time. Enjoy the rest of the Symposium. Please do rate this session as well. I would appreciate any feedback that you gave me. Thank you so much.